oh my God, server components are breaking my app. They're making React so much harder. I have to pay for servers just to serve my web application. Why is everything falling apart? This is the end of React. It's time to move to Svelte. No, it's not. Calm down. Let's talk about this a bit. There's a lot of misunderstandings going on around server components. I want to go through a bunch of the FUD and general concern people have with server components, both the valid concerns, but more importantly, the misconceptions I see a lot of people have. I recommend watching the whole thing though, because there's a lot of valuable insight on server components throughout. If you're just here for my thoughts on Vercel's involvement, that's going to be at the end. The misconception I see that breaks my heart the most is I can already do this with X, be it SvelteKit or Remix or TRPC or Relay or all of these other tools and technologies that exist in, around, and outside of React. The point of server components isn't to provide new functionality that couldn't exist before. That was never even the goal of React. React didn't make it possible to do things that were impossible before. React made it easier to do the right thing simply and make it more maintainable too. That's the goal of server components. There are many other ways to fetch data in your applications, even your React apps. There are many more ways to render your React code on a server. There are many more ways to do things than what server components do. But there is no simpler way to use React to fetch data and have a good experience. The beauty of server components is how simple it makes the relationship between your server and your client, and how well it defines that relationship by only having some pieces run on client and only having some pieces run on server. The mental model might seem like there is more, and it might not seem like you're getting a lot of benefits. And that's the mindset that I hate the most, because the default of using server components is you make a faster, simpler, better application. It's not about the features it unlocks, although the streaming stuff is best in class and nothing else has it at that level. The benefit is how much easier it makes doing the right thing for your users and how much easier it makes it to maintain that thing as a developer. It's really good at simplifying your experience. It's not trying to reinvent the wheel in terms of what your web apps can do. So stop telling me what Svelte can do, because that's not what this is about. Something I hinted at there that I really want to dig in on though is the complexity. It seems like a lot of people misconstrue more with more complex. React having more features and more behaviors does not inherently make it more complex. If you've ever dealt with useEffect, you probably understand what I mean. Something like useEffect is only one thing, but it's one thing that's inherently really complex. In particular, debugging it is very complex. It is incredibly difficult to figure out why a useEffect went from behaving totally fine to misfiring millions of times and causing huge outages, which I've even experienced in my time. The complexity of useEffect was deep. And what I see with the new model is the complexity is much shallower. There may be more things, but the depth of complexity in each of those things is much less. And the amount of time I have to spend going from a problem to a solution is much shorter, especially when debugging. Not all of the errors are great, I'll be honest. I regularly run into problems where the error is this component cannot render or this import doesn't work. But the amount of change before and after is usually small enough that I can identify what's up. And even with some of the weirder errors that I've reported to the core React and Vercel teams, it was easy to figure out what caused it, because things don't break later, they break immediately in the new model. And it's been hard to find edge cases where the error didn't make it really clear what had changed to cause the problem. And that shallowness of the complexity is what I appreciate so much about the new model. I don't spend anywhere near as much time debugging. And that's just hard to explain or much less measure. It's a feeling. And I don't feel like I'm bashing my head on the wall anywhere near as much with the new model as I did before server components. One that I'm seeing more of, and I'll be honest, feeling a bit of myself, is the breakage. If you're heavily bought into something like TRPC, React Query, styled components, or any of these other solutions, they might not work great in the server component model, especially stuff on the style side. CSS and JS just does not work well with server rendering. I could sit here and say I think that's okay, but I'm going to get a bunch of pushback. What I do want to emphasize is how well use client works if your behaviors are client-side stuff. Something like React Query does actually work if you're only using it inside of client components. Something like context does work if you're only accessing it inside of client components. You can still wrap your app in a giant context and access it in things deep down the tree, but you'll only be able to have that access in a client component, which is fine. If you're using context, it should not be just as a prop drill for server-side stuff. The value of context isn't that it makes it easy to access the same value in multiple places. The value of context is it lets you build a relationship between a point in your DOM tree and nodes beneath it that is controlled by you as a developer. You might choose to put that at the top of your app, you might not, but it's not for taking some data you fetched and just passing it down your tree. In fact, you can just call the same function 5 places in your app, and it will only call it once if you wrap it with cache or just use fetch. It's truly magical how much power you get from this new model, and that context feels like a bad abstraction unless you're doing very specific interactions. And generally, if you're using context correctly, it will still work the way you've always used it in that interactive use client layer. On the topic of things breaking though, we need to talk about Angular, specifically Angular 2. I've seen a lot of people comparing server components to Angular and the move from AngularJS to Angular, which if you weren't there when this happened, got nicknamed the Red Wedding. And there's a good reason for that. Your AngularJS code just did not work in an Angular 2 app and vice versa. There was no real interop or backwards compatibility story there because Angular rewrote the core of how it worked. This was absolutely the right call. The framework is much better after that overhaul. But anybody maintaining an AngularJS app looked over their shoulder with frustration, jealousy, envy, anger, and a lot of other feelings. I see a lot of people who feel the same way with server components. And on one hand, I get it. If you're working in an old Create React app, you see how much better things are getting on the other side of the fence, and you don't have a good path there. That sucks. Where with hooks, it was pretty hard to work in a React app that couldn't adopt hooks some amount. Server components do, for better or worse, expect you to use Next.js right now or to implement your own much more complex layer. That is not an acceptable path for people who are on Create React app right now. I think the inability to use the new features is being conflated with the inability to interop with the old ones. In my video about why I bet on React, I actually show an example where I took a React component from 2014 and rendered it as a server component. Yes, an ancient old create class component before traditional class components. I had to import a helper to backfill the old behavior, but I was able to take a component from 2014 and render it on server in the new model. If you initialize a new app, you can copy paste over almost all of your old code, put a single use client on the top of the route, and for the most part, will still behave. And that's magic. React's backwards and forwards compatibility story is the best in the industry. It's incredible that you can run code that old successfully against code that is much less old. I'm really frustrated about the Angular 2 comparisons for that reason, because it feels like people don't understand what the problem with the Angular 2 move was. It wasn't that you struggled to upgrade to Angular 2. It's that you had no story of interop between them at all. And server components are a flag you turn on. You still use all your old code. We're obviously not there yet if you're on Create React app, but progress is being made, and it's a really unfair comparison. We do have to talk about performance and production readiness, though. I've seen a lot of people saying that server components are slow. If you're talking about the dev experience, yeah, the hot reloading is not as fast as it used to be. Their focus is on TurboPack, and I do hope to see some huge performance wins there, but work will be done. On my M2 Mac, it still hot refreshes in less than a second, almost always. The initial boot can take a little bit of time, but it's not too bad. And that is also just the dev experience. There's a future where if the solutions they're working on don't work, we just do some crazy hacks with a Vite or individual file builds that will. But until we're there, it's not something that there's too much to say on. It sucks that older machines have a bad dev experience on big app router apps, but it's something they're working really hard on fixing, and I trust them to do that. But the actual performance once you've deployed, it's not just good, it's great. The speed at which a React app renders the output HTML is a really weird thing to benchmark. Jack Harrington did a video where he compares the page directory to app router for render performance. I have a long video here where I talk about why I don't think that's the best comparison, but I do show off in that with my own benchmarks where the benefits come, which is the granular request level ability to cache some requests and not cache others. It makes it so much easier to make your app insanely performant in production. And we've seen an order of magnitude difference with how much faster our applications feel and actually get the right data down to our users. And when you combine that with the benefits of suspense, where you can have some content come in immediately and more content flow in naturally after as part of the same request, it's unreal. The experience of both the user and the developer in making something that is performant is better than it's ever been. And measuring like micro millisecond differences in how many pages you can render per second is not how you feel these differences, especially once you're deploying things serverless at scale. So I don't like a lot of the performance arguments that I've heard. App Router has enabled me to build some of the most performant things I've ever made. But what about the production readiness? I see a lot of comments around this, like App Router isn't actually stable. They're just calling it that for marketing. It's using an unstable version of React. How are they calling it stable? Server actions are entirely broken. Let's go through this one at a time. The App Router being stable means that the syntax, behavior, and experience of using it is stable. And that's the case. Maybe the dev experience is slower than it should be. They're working on that. Maybe they'll add more features in the future. I'm sure they will. Maybe the server actions are unstable. You don't have to use them. I'm actually only using them on like one app and barely. Important to understand the difference between App Router and the whole server component ecosystem, in that App Router's goal was to rethink how we manage routing in our next applications, and it has succeeded with flying colors. Even if you're not using server components and you use client everything, the new routing system is so much easier to work with and reason about for complex applications, and it's stable. All of the behaviors as they behave right now will be there and supported some amount for the foreseeable future. I'm sure that there are bugs that will be fixed that will cause some breaks for some people. But generally speaking, the way App Router works now is a thing they intend to support and a thing that does work really well. I haven't experienced instability, I've experienced incompatibility, but that is different. The App Router itself is very stable. What about React though? If App Router is using an unstable React version, is it really stable? Well, yeah, it is, because you're not using the unstable React version. They are massaging the unstable syntax and API definitions in the new React version into a shape that they expect you to consume and use. If you were building your own server rendering model for server components, then yes, React's instability is going to affect you because those APIs might change. But when Next is calling Next.js App Router stable, when React underneath isn't, that's because if the behavior of React changes, Next will massage that out so we as the developers consuming Next don't feel those differences. React going from unstable to stable with server components should not affect the way that you build things in Next at all. That is a very important difference that I don't think is understood well enough. The App Router itself and the way that we interop with it, that layer is stable. And I know because I've been shipping it for more than 6 months now, and it was not stable when we started, and it feels very stable now. But a big part of why I adopted this and why I have the opinions I have is, I'll be transparent, I'm pretty close with Vercel. I've been chatting with them more and more. They obviously are a sponsor of the channel. They have no idea I'm making this video. They certainly wouldn't have asked me to. They probably won't approve half the stuff I said in it anyways. I bring this up because I think Vercel is the victim of a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt that doesn't feel fair. There is a palpable concern that React is being taken over. The thing that's really frustrating to me there is that before Vercel's involvement, React was just Meta. It was just Facebook and one small team that made every decision, that controlled everything, that wasn't even funded as well as it should have been and could have been thrown away at any point. With Vercel having like 10% of the core React team working there, combined with like another 5 to 10% of people who don't work at Meta or Facebook, it's like 70 to 80% work at Meta still. 10% don't, 10% work at Vercel. It's a very small percentage of the core team that works at Vercel. Those people might be really impactful. Like Sebastian Markbridge is an absolute legend, and ACD is obviously really talented as well. But that's like the amount of impact is different from the amount of core team. And the people at Meta who still run most of React, still make a lot of the decisions, they obviously are building around a lot of Sebastian's vision, but that doesn't mean Vercel owns the vision. In fact, it means the opposite. Sebastian went to Vercel because they were the better place to execute important parts of his vision, which is the server side. As React embraced the server more and more, working at a company that still uses PHP on the server was not the right call for Sebastian, and he went where it made the most sense to make the impact he wanted to on React and on web dev. And that's why Vercel and React are closer. It's not because Vercel is out here trying to evilly take over React. It's, again, kind of the opposite. It's React's core team wants to expand beyond what Facebook and Meta intended React to be. And to do such, they have to go other places and work with other companies. And funny enough, after trying to work with Shopify, after trying to work with Remix, after trying to work with many others in the industry, the Meta team and the React core team found that Vercel was the best to work with and understood and embraced the vision better than anyone else. Hydrogen by Shopify did use server components for a bit, and they gave it up because, to be fair, it was very early and made their lives harder and didn't provide a great experience for the developers they were targeting. Vercel doubled down with App Router, and that commitment is why the teams are so close. Vercel was the place where this vision could be executed on the server side, and that's why a lot of this happened. Obviously, this makes the relationship between Next and React much closer, which has resulted in a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt from people, but I don't think it's fair either. Obviously, if you want the best React experience with all of these new features, the way to do that is Next. It's weird that you have to use another framework to get all of the benefits of React, but it was also weird you had to use Webpack to even ship React in the first place. React's always been willing to embrace external dependencies that make it easier to use and benefit from React's model. And that's why things like the ESLint rules for React hooks are so important, why things like the JSX transpiler and Babel are so important. React isn't just React. React needs to work with other tools to be valuable. And for something as complex as server components, you need a framework that is built around these ideas. Next was the framework that had the most buy-in and the most willingness to try this new thing out. It makes a lot of sense that React is best used with Next right now. I'm excited for a future where the React model for server components has stabilized enough that we could see more and more alternatives spin up. The same way we saw Webpack alternatives all target React, where we got Vite, ESBuild, Snowpack, what's the one I'm forgetting? SWR, or SWC, and TurboPack now too. This ecosystem of tools formed after React showed how valuable it was to have a bundler that worked with it. Now that React has shown how powerful it is to work closely with a framework like Next, I would expect other things like obviously Astro and Remix, as well as new frameworks being created by people who work at Astro and people who work on things like point manuals. I know Daishi has some cool stuff coming. The potential to build new things with these primitives and new frameworks around them is so exciting. And Next.js dogfooding it for us is awesome and incredibly weirdly generous of them. If it wasn't for Next falling on the sword here, we would have had years upon years of figuring this out, many small crappy meta frameworks spinning up and falling apart, and people being stuck on stuff like Create React App. By embracing a team and framework as stable, well-maintained, and impactful as Next, React has now made the initial adoption of something huge way less scary. But people are still scared of that adoption because a lot of front-end devs are scared of servers. This is the final point I wanted to make. People think Vercel's goal here is just to sell servers. And I think that's incredibly dumb for so many reasons. The biggest of which is simply that you can run way less compute with the new model. Caching has gotten so much easier that it's incredibly easy to opt out of many calls you had to make before. You're actually going to see cheaper bills on your infrastructure using the new model if you take any advantage of the new benefits and behaviors. I think Vercel's goal is very simple. Make it so easy for full stack web devs to build things well that the slow part is deploying. And if they're the best way to deploy, they win. It's always been their focus. And I think they're doing a great job at it, especially when you see the features that Next adds that don't necessarily lock you in more, but make deploying the best performant thing easy as hell. There's no other solution where moving from running on Node to running on Edge is a single export variable you just throw in a route file. The relationship between Next exports and Vercel deploying stuff correctly is incredibly powerful, but it's not the goal of the new architecture. The goal of the new architecture is to help full stack developers build better things faster and more effectively, and also have less server cost. Because if they succeed at that, and this model becomes the way everyone builds things, Vercel will have a much higher adoption rate in both like hobbyist world and in greater industry. If you lower the cost of everything else so much that the deployment's the hard part, paying someone to handle that for you makes a lot of sense. But again, the goal here isn't to sell a bunch of servers, it's to help developers be more and more successful, knowing that if they are, they'll eventually come to their tools. This is the model that Epic Games has used for a long time, where their goal's always been empower game developers to be as successful as possible. So when they work at a big company and they're building a big game, they know to lean on Epic's tools because they're the ones that understand game dev the best. That's Vercel's goal here, to be the ones who build and understand web dev and web dev tooling the best. And they know if they succeed there, that ultimately they will win. But this isn't about ramping up how many servers we spin up on Vercel. This is about ramping up how many applications we can deploy, how effectively we can deploy them, and how much success we can find building with these tools. I think Vercel's gotten an unfair rep here, and I know I already can see the comments. You're paid by Vercel. They just spend a bunch of money to make you think this. Do you know how much more money I could make if I took any other sponsor? It's hilarious. I'm saying this because it's how I feel. Vercel is making web dev better, and they'll make some money doing it. But the goal here is to make web dev better. It's the same reason they bought Svelte. Their focus is the future of how we build, not how many servers they can get one user to deploy on their blog. I think that's all I have to say about this. I'm going to do a more thorough review of server components in the near future. If I already have it out, it'll be pinned in the corner. I probably don't yet though, so what's going to be there instead is a video all about performance in server components, because I think it's an important thing to talk about. Thank you guys as always. Really appreciate it. Let me know what you've been thinking about server components. Thanks as always. Peace, nerds.